Hey Teta, how you doing?
Doing
Uh,
great in you.
Good, good. Uh, I have a couple of questions for you regarding your role as an ambassador. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my position is as a consul general, which is a diplomat, but also more importantly, I chair the United Nations Association, which is the advocacy group for the United Nations. We promote the mission and goals of the United Nations. And so when we talk about education, when we talk about refugees, when we talk about immigrant issues, when we talk about general human rights issues, that's what the United Nations was established to do, was to protect the rights, human rights. And so when we're talking in terms of education, now we have the Sustainable Development Goals that came out of the UN for 2015. From 2000 to 2015, we had what was called the member states organized and signed on to the Millennium Development Goals, which meant that there were goals that countries agreed that we would try to meet in terms of eradicating poverty, ensuring gender equity, ensuring access to quality education. So after 2015, they were revisited. And then all the member states signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals. We call those the global goals or the SDGs. And specifically, there are those for education. There are those for certainly all of it is human rights, but then there's gender equity, access, building stronger, sustainable communities. So what we're talking about in our session involves several of those global goals because they all interact. And that's our concern. So that when we started seeing issues regarding the separation of families, immigrant and refugee children being treated in hostile, I would say, situations or attitudes at the borders or problems in schools and all, that came under these global goals in terms of how do we create partnerships to ensure that the human rights of these students and their families are upheld. And so the United Nations Association is very much involved in ensuring those rights, in helping institutions work through ways and strategies of dealing with these issues.
Uh-huh. Um, what effect do you think family separation has on a child?
Oh, there are many clear studies in terms of the effects of trauma. In fact, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has done many studies. And it's interesting because we're talking about trauma regarding refugee students or children, but also this is trauma just in our neighborhood. So our students, no matter where they're coming from, many of them do experience trauma. And we have seen it in the classrooms. We may not know that's where it's coming from, but we certainly have seen the effects of it. And they include such things as loss of the child's sense of self. So when we have kids who, seem to just sort of gravitate towards other things that are negative, perhaps trying to get some type of identity, that's part of it. When we've seen their sense of safety is affected. So if you have children or students in the classrooms and perhaps there are socialization issues, part of that may be because of their sense of safety has been affected through whatever trauma they've experienced,
And
or even in terms of communication with teachers.
uh would you say that kids who are being separated from their families um, at the border undergo that sort of trauma?
Oh, certainly. In fact, if we go down the checklist, and I didn't finish all of the checklists because it's numerous, but we will see all of these behaviors: loss of trust, inability to thrive, depression, separation related post-traumatic stress disorder. We even have that. And then what happens is it's an increase in behavioral issues in the schools. It's an increase of dropout. It's an increase of damaging coping skills. They're not able to cope with things. And so we may see not only behavior, but drug abuse and things like that. But our immediate concern with the border issue is we get into depression, we get into safety issues, a sense of safety, and especially when we're talking about the younger children.
And would you say, I mean, I think you've already answered this question, but I want to ask it directly. Would you say that separating children from families is inhumane and cruel?
Oh, certainly, and it goes against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's specific language in the Universal Declaration that specifically talks about separating children and the effects of children and what governments can and cannot do regarding them.
Uh-huh. And you were saying that the trauma that the children experience also spills into the classroom, into their educational setting. And can you touch on that a little bit more? You did say that earlier, but can you touch on that a little bit more?
Yes, we see it in the classroom in terms of effectiveness in classwork, follow through, because focus is not there. We see it in terms of socialization. How does a student like that get along with other students? We see it in depression, so that what may be a child seeming to be isolated or nonverbal or non-communicative may be because that child is going through a form of depression as a result of the separation.
And how do you think that challenges the teacher? I mean, does that present challenges for the teachers as well?
Oh, certainly, because I'm not sure at this point whether in our teacher education curriculum, we have shaped it to address some of these current issues that are much more prevalent now than they've ever been in our educational system. So that there are certain things that we must do in terms of teachers. Number one, we have to be able to identify the difference in the children that are there. The difference meaning, are they displaced children? Are they migrant? Are they refugee? Are they traumatized by neighborhood issues? So that because the children come there out of different circumstances, and they're not all the same circumstances, but I think in our teaching and in our looking at our classroom, we look at everyone as the same, which is good in terms of we look at them equally. But in order to address their individual barriers, we have to take into consideration, where did this student come from? And even in our assignments, sometimes which is a very nice assignment, for instance, they'll say, well, let's do a family tree, or let's do a genealogy study, and not be sensitive that some kids may not have the family. So what do? Or even when we do father-daughter dances, right? So what happens to a kid who doesn't have a father figure or something like that? So we have to start becoming a little bit more sensitive. And those are the social areas. Uh-huh. But in terms of our curriculum and the classwork, we have to also examine our content, course content. Are the textbooks written in a way that celebrate diversity? Do kids see themselves in the stories? Or are they stories biased towards one ethnic group, leaving out the other ethnic groups? Which means then a kid may look at that and say, I don't see myself in there, therefore my ethnic group is not as valued as another. And of course, we've seen that historically. But now I think it's even more of an urgency to try to correct that and making sure that our textbooks are multicultural, that our teachers are trained into cultural sensitivity, those types of areas.
And the same, of course, would be true of standardized testing, right?
Sure. If we have words on a test that are specific to particular regions, then it's no way a kid that doesn't even live in that region or that local color area is going to do well on that type of vocabulary. Right. I gave some college students a test. I said, what's a buoy? Well, if you've never lived near water or had anything to do with water, you have no idea what it is. So already there's a bias, whether it's regional, whether it's language, whether it's cultural. So we do have to keep examining our standardized tests for those types of elements.
Thank you. To close the interview, Teta, if you had advice for politicians regarding family separation, what would you advise?
Well, I would advise them to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is for everyone. and they were constructed 70 years ago. That's what Eleanor Roosevelt worked on right after the formation of the United Nations, foreseeing that as we become a more global society, we're going to have to learn how to get along with each other and respect the human rights of everyone. And just as we require other nations to abide by human rights, we have to do the same thing. So whether it's on the local level or the state level or the national level, we have to always push to ensure that our representatives, our governmental representatives, not only uphold our local laws, and make sure that they abide by human rights, but also the national. So sometimes we look at the human rights issue and say, oh, well, that's for the United Nations to do. That doesn't involve our city, when in fact it does. It goes from top down, from the world view of things to even our local governments.
Teta, I learned so much from you at the town hall in Houston and again today. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon.
And thank you so much, and thank you so much for bringing this issue to the forefront.
Okay, bye-bye, Teta.
Goodbye.